He sat motionless on a weathered park bench, wrapped in a tattered army jacket, his eyes fixed on the sky, like he was waiting for something the world had long forgotten. Locals called him Old Ghost, just another homeless man fading into the background. No one asked his name. No one cared to know his story, until a boy with a peanut butter sandwich saw past the dirt in silence and uncovered a truth that would bring a town to its knees. This is the story of Frank Holloway, a man everyone overlooked, until the day a Blackhawk helicopter landed in Riverside Park and the world finally remembered who he was. Frank Holloway had been a fixture in Riverside Park for so long that most people had stopped noticing he was there at all. At 76, he blended into the landscape like the cracked sidewalks or the rusted bench under the elm tree, unmoving, unremarkable, almost invisible. The neighborhood kids called him the Old Ghost. He never caused trouble, never shouted, never asked for help. He moved so quietly it was as if he existed on another plane, drifting through life as a shadow no one dared to touch. Each morning long before the city woke up, Frank would rise from his curled position on the bench, his thin, weathered hands trembling from the morning chill. He sat perfectly still, eyes lifted toward the sky, gazing past the branches and clouds as if searching for something, someone far beyond. His lips would move ever so slightly, whispering words only the wind could hear. The routine never wavered. Whether the sun blazed or the rain poured, Frank looked to the heavens and spoke with quiet reverence. Some thought he was praying, others believed he was chasing fragments of memory. But no one asked. No one cared enough to find out. He didn't carry signs like others. He never held a cardboard plea for mercy, nor did he sit with a cup rattling coins. When strangers tried to hand him money, he would politely nod and refuse, or simply ignore them altogether. The only offering he ever accepted came in the form of food, scraps quietly left at dusk by staff from Leo's Diner across the street. A brown paper bag would appear near the edge of the park, sometimes filled with eggs and toast, sometimes just a half sandwich. Frank would collect it silently and vanish into the trees. Unlike others living on the street, Frank's belongings were few and carefully guarded. A worn canvas backpack never left his reach. A small metal tin, sealed tight with duct tape, was always tucked inside. Around his neck, beneath layers of clothing and time, hung a pair of faded military dog tags. Only a few keen eyes had ever noticed them, and fewer still had dared to ask what they meant. Inside his tattered sleeping bag, some swore they saw an old insignia, a military emblem barely visible, the stitching frayed and bleached by years of sun and rain. No one could say for sure where it came from, but it added to the quiet mystery of the man under the elm tree. From time to time, other homeless veterans passed through the park. Most were just passing through. But some, those who had seen war, who recognized the weight behind a silent stare, would nod to Frank from afar. A few saluted. Frank never returned the salute, but when it happened, his back would straighten just a little. His gaze sharpened slightly, as though some long dormant part of him stirred. To the rest of the city, Frank was just another piece of forgotten humanity. A relic, a problem, a man to be pitied or ignored. Children were warned not to go near him. Runners swerved wide around his bench. Shop owners complained when he sat too close to their storefronts. Occasionally, security was called to move him along, though it never lasted. Frank always returned to the same spot, under the same tree, facing the same stretch of sky. And then, one morning, as a group of teenagers passed him by laughing, one of them called out mockingly, "Get a job, you bum!" The words echoed cruelly in the crisp morning air. Frank didn't react. He simply remained curled on the bench, his face half hidden under the brim of a worn cap, hands trembling as usual, wrapped in that old, faded army jacket. A city worker sweeping nearby muttered under his breath, "That guy's been around for years, just part of the trash now." By noon that day, someone called security again. Another complaint. Another attempt to clear the area of what people saw as a stain, a nuisance, a forgotten life. No one offered kindness. No one asked if he was cold. There were only mutters, stares, and a wall of disgust thick enough to choke on. But exactly 24 hours later, everything changed. The skies above Riverside Park roared with sound. A Blackhawk helicopter descended from the clouds, slicing the air with thundering blades. Dust and dry leaves swirled through the park, sending pigeons scattering and people shielding their eyes. The ground trembled. Crowds formed. Phones came out. Children stopped mid-run. Every eye turned to the sky. Soldiers poured out in full tactical gear, their faces unreadable, their movements efficient. And then, cutting through the crowd, a high-ranking officer strode directly toward that same weathered bench beneath the elm tree. He stopped, stood at attention, and offered a sharp, respectful salute. "Sir, we've been looking for you," the officer said. Time seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent. Phones hung suspended midair. Whispers evaporated. They all stared at the old man on the bench, at Frank Holloway. The same man they had mocked, ignored, avoided, and now they were about to find out who he really was. He never asked for anything. Every morning he simply sat there, gazing up at the sky like he was waiting for something or someone that never seemed to come. Whatever it was, it still hadn't arrived. That Tuesday morning, the air felt lighter. The sun finally broke through the lingering gray clouds that had hung over the city for days. With the sudden warmth came a wave of life into Riverside Park. Students ditching class, couples stealing early lunch breaks, and the typical sound of teenagers shouting and filming each other, trying to go viral. Among them, a group of 5 teens, 3 boys and 2 girls, no older than 17, strolled along the edge of the park, full of energy and adolescent boldness. One of the boys, tall and loud, wore a neon hoodie far too bright for the season. With his phone raised like a badge of status, he began narrating in a booming voice, putting on the exaggerated charisma of someone who imagined millions were watching. "Yo, check it out, people," he said, aiming the camera ahead. "Live from Riverside, and what do we have here? Old Ghost in his natural habitat." The camera turned and zoomed toward a bench nestled beneath the trees, where Frank Holloway sat in his usual spot. Quiet, still. Not asleep, not entirely present either. Just watching the clouds drift by overhead. At his side rested a neatly placed canvas backpack, and across his lap, a carefully folded sleeping bag. "Say something, man," the teen shouted, still recording. "Yo, you alive or what?" The others burst into laughter. "Maybe he's a robot," one of the girls quipped. "Look at him, doesn't even blink." Another boy jumped in. "Nah, he's a leftover." "A leftover?" the girl asked, tilting her head. "Yeah," he grinned. "Leftover from the last century." Their laughter came again, louder this time. One boy kicked a pebble toward the bench. It bounced once and landed near Frank's boots. Still, Frank didn't flinch. He just kept staring at the sky, unmoved, unbothered, or perhaps simply too tired to care. "Dude, this is gold," the boy with the phone whispered gleefully. "This'll blow up. Watch." They kept circling him like children taunting an old lion in a cage. They hurled him, exaggerated his silence, copied his pose. One of the girls dropped to the grass and crossed her legs, lifting her chin skyward in mock meditation. "He's probably watching for alien spaceships," she said, giggling. That's when Leo appeared. The daytime security guard from the shopping plaza across the street. Leo was in his late 50s, heavy-set, and wore a badge that didn't hold legal weight, but managed to unsettle teenagers just the same. "What's going on here?" he barked, tugging his belt up with a grunt. The teens jumped slightly, their laughter faltering. One of the boys mumbled, "Just talking to the old guy." Leo glanced at Frank, then back to the kids. "You've made your point. Move along." No one argued. They shuffled off in loose formation, muttering and smirking. One of them tossed a lazy salute toward Frank before disappearing down the trail. Leo turned back toward the bench with a sigh. "Frank," he said more softly this time, "you know we've had complaints." Frank didn't move, didn't even blink. "Families are nervous," Leo went on. "People want to enjoy the park." Still nothing. "I've got to call this in." There was regret in his voice, but also resignation. The park supervisors are getting pressure from the city. They want all non-residents cleared out. Leo didn't wait for a reply. He pulled out his radio and called it in. Less than 10 minutes later, a city patrol car rolled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out. One was young, fresh-faced, still a little too alert to the small injustices he'd have to enforce. The other was older, his face lined, tired from years of telling people they couldn't stay, they couldn't sit, they couldn't exist in places meant for everyone else. The older officer approached the bench. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. You can't stay here any longer." Frank didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. With the slow, deliberate movements of someone long acquainted with pain, he leaned forward and began to pack. First, the sleeping bag, worn and faded but folded with military precision despite the frayed edges. Then the canvas backpack, clearly old but clean, as if its condition was a matter of pride. And finally, from beneath the bench, Frank pulled out two items. The first was a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked, the soles barely holding together, but the laces were tied perfectly, knotted with care only a soldier would understand. The second was a small tarnished badge, military, once gleaming, now chipped at the edges, with one corner missing completely. It looked like it belonged to a uniform many years ago. Now it was looped through a keyring and a twist of thin wire, held together not by purpose, but memory. He packed them slowly, almost reverently, as if the act itself was a ritual, not just survival. No one watching spoke. The officers didn't mock him. They didn't offer help either. They just stood there, silent, waiting for him to finish, waiting for him to disappear. Frank swung the worn canvas bag over his shoulder with practiced ease, gave a single nod as if confirming something only he understood, and started walking out of the park. His pace was calm and measured, unhurried, as though he'd done this very thing 1,000 times before. The world around him kept moving, mostly unaware. The hot dog vendor glanced up momentarily, blinked in vague recognition, then returned to tending his cart. A woman, lost in her phone during her lunch break, didn't even look up. A mother crossing the sidewalk pulled her child a little closer, murmuring something under her breath about those kinds of people. We've all grown used to seeing worn-out coats, stained hands, and weathered shoes, but we rarely look into the eyes that carry lifetimes of weight, and Frank carried that weight silently. He didn't flinch at the stairs. He didn't look back for anyone's approval. He simply walked. And when he passed through the iron gates of Riverside Park, something invisible seemed to go with him. The bench where he'd sat every morning now looked emptier, like the park itself had lost a piece of its soul, and nobody even noticed. To most passers-by, Frank Holloway was just another forgotten old man, a fixture on the park bench whose presence was as ordinary as the trees and pigeons. But to Liam Carson, a 12-year-old boy who lived just 2 blocks away, Frank was anything but ordinary. Every afternoon after school, Liam rode his bike through the winding paths of Riverside Park. It was faster than taking the street and more fun. In the beginning, Frank was just another strange figure, quiet, still, and a little intimidating. Liam, like everyone else, was curious, maybe a little scared. But unlike everyone else, Liam didn't walk away. He started noticing things, small things, like how Frank folded his sleeping bag every morning with military precision, how he never left so much as a crumb of trash behind, and how, no matter how cold or hungry he looked, he never asked anyone for anything. One day, after seeing Frank chew on nothing but a tough crust of bread pulled from a crumpled paper sack, Liam decided he couldn't just pass by anymore. The next morning, he added an extra peanut butter and jelly sandwich to his backpack. After school, he biked slowly through the park and rolled up near Frank's usual bench. Without saying a word, he placed the sandwich, carefully wrapped in a brown paper bag, by Frank's feet and rode away. Frank didn't say thank you. He barely moved, just gave the faintest nod and returned to gazing at the clouds above. But that moment started something. From then on, every other day, Liam brought something small, half a sandwich, a granola bar, an apple. Frank never refused. He didn't speak much, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way he accepted the offering. Over time, Liam could tell Frank wasn't just there because he had nowhere else to go. There was purpose in the way he sat. Stillness, not defeat. One afternoon, as the golden light of autumn filtered through the swirling leaves, Liam stayed a little longer than usual. He stood beside Frank's bench, his bike at his side, watching the man's face as he looked up at the clouds, as if reading something written only for him. Then Liam's eyes dropped to Frank's wrist. Wrapped around it was a faded cloth bracelet. It was frayed and discolored, thin from years of wear. It didn't look like much, just a simple strip of fabric tied snugly, but something about it felt important. Embroidered in dark green thread was a small symbol, a falcon enclosed in a triangle. Liam's curiosity bubbled up. "What's that?" he asked softly, pointing. Frank glanced down at the bracelet like he'd forgotten it was even there. For a second, a distant look passed through his eyes. And then, for the first time in days, maybe weeks, he smiled. "It's a gift," he said, voice low and rough. "From who?" Liam asked. Frank's answer came slowly, like he had to pull each word out from a place long buried. "My team," he said. "We all had one. Made 'em ourselves before we left." "Left where?" Frank didn't respond. He looked back up at the sky, and after a pause, he added quietly, "Not all of us came home." Liam didn't press him further. He just nodded, climbed onto his bike, and pedaled home. But he couldn't stop thinking about the bracelet. That night, lying in bed, Liam couldn't get the image of that strange green symbol out of his head. He grabbed his tablet and opened the browser. He typed in every detail he could remember. Falcon triangle patch, military cloth bracelet. Most of the results were useless. Fashion blogs, images, bird tattoos. But one old grainy photo stopped him cold. It was buried deep in a dusty forum thread from years ago. The image showed a group of rugged men in camouflage, standing proudly in front of a military helicopter. Each man wore an identical cloth bracelet. The caption read, "Eschunit 6, 1978. Last photo before Operation Rainfire." Liam's heart beat faster as he clicked through more links. The deeper he searched, the stranger the story became. Eschunit 6, he learned, was a Special Forces reconnaissance team deployed on a top-secret mission to Southeast Asia. According to the limited declassified reports, the team had vanished during the operation. No confirmed survivors, no official explanation. They were simply listed as missing in action. But now Liam knew at least one of them had come back. Liam couldn't shake the image from his mind. The bracelet, the symbol, the chilling possibility that Frank Holloway wasn't just some quiet, forgotten man in the park. That night, sleep never really came. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts racing like a storm through his head. Could Frank truly be part of Echo Unit 6, the special ops team presumed dead decades ago, in a covert mission with no survivors ever reported? Or was it worse? Was he the last one? But Liam was certain of one thing. Frank Holloway was not who everyone thought he was. He didn't keep this discovery to himself. As soon as the sun broke over the rooftops, Liam sat down at the kitchen table across from his grandfather, Robert Carson, a quiet man who carried his Vietnam service like a shadow. Over eggs and toast, Liam laid everything out. The photo of the bracelet, the symbol sewn into it, the online search that led him to the story of Echo Unit 6. Robert didn't respond at first. He just stared at his grandson, a forkful of eggs halfway to his mouth. Then he froze. "Say that again," he said, his voice low. Liam repeated the details, slower this time. Robert set down his fork, pushed his plate aside, and rose to his feet with a strange look in his eyes. Without a word, he walked to the living room and crouched beside a worn, wooden box tucked beneath the bookshelf. It was covered in faded stickers from long, shuttered army bases and smelled of time and dust. He opened it carefully, like it held something sacred, and began flipping through old papers, brittle files, and yellowing photos. Minutes passed. Then he found it, a single laminated page, and handed it to Liam. "Look at the name," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam squinted. The ink had faded over the years, but the letters were still there. CPT Frank Holloway. Echo 6. Robert sank back into the armchair like the air had been knocked out of him. "I thought he was dead," he murmured. "We all did." He sat in silence for a moment, then reached for the landline phone on the end table. No contacts, no searching. He just dialed from memory. The number had been tucked away in his mind for years, untouched but never forgotten. "Eddie," he said as soon as the call connected, "I need you to come to Riverside Park. There's someone you need to see." An hour later, Robert and Liam stood across the street from Frank's usual bench. Frank was there, right where he always sat, under the same tree, still and silent, eyes turned skyward. He didn't look at them. He didn't acknowledge them. But Robert didn't need him to. With deliberate care, Robert raised his hand and offered a slow, solemn salute. Frank didn't return it, but his eyes flickered. Just for a second. And that second was enough. In small towns, word spreads like wildfire, especially among veterans. That afternoon, two elderly men appeared in the park, both wearing old military ball caps, worn with age and pride. They didn't approach. They didn't ask questions. They simply stood across the path from Frank, stared for a few long moments, and offered their own salutes before walking away. The next morning, 5 more came, then 7. By the second day's end, over a dozen men had stood before Frank Holloway's bench. Many of them hadn't worn a uniform in years. Some pulled jackets from storage, others polished old service pins. They came quietly, alone or in pairs. They didn't speak. They didn't interrupt. They simply stood at attention and saluted, each one showing silent recognition to the man they now believed was Captain Frank Holloway, the long-lost commander of Echo 6. Frank didn't speak. He never stood, never returned the salute, but he saw them all. His eyes, usually vacant, held something now, something unspoken. His expression gave nothing away, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 memories. The townspeople began to take notice. People walking to the farmer's market paused near the bench. Joggers slowed their pace under the trees. Conversations hushed. One teenager posted a blurry photo online, a row of saluting veterans before the same man many had ignored for years. The caption read, "Does anyone know who this man really is?" It spread like wildfire. By nightfall, whispers swept through the town. Was he in the military? I heard he led a classified rescue in Vietnam. Someone said he was left behind, abandoned by his own government. Speculation blossomed into awe. People who once crossed the street to avoid him now lingered nearby. Some brought him coffee. Others just stood quietly at a distance, unsure of what they were witnessing, but aware that something significant was unfolding. And beneath it all, beneath the attention, the salutes, the rumors, and the long overdue respect, sat Frank Holloway. Still, silent, waiting. The morning began like any other. A pale gray sky stretched over Riverside Park, clinging to the final coolness of dawn. The world was slowly stirring awake. Dog walkers strolled in easy rhythm, joggers pounded the paths, and elderly couples shuffled hand in hand, savoring the quiet comfort of routine. Beneath a familiar cluster of old trees, Frank Holloway sat as he always did, silent, still, and seemingly invisible to the bustle around him. He had been a fixture there for years, so constant that people hardly noticed him anymore. But at exactly 8:15 a.m., everything changed. It started with a sound, deep, distant, like thunder rolling over the hills. Then it grew louder and heavier, shaking rooftops and setting off car alarms. Birds erupted from trees in chaotic flocks, wings flapping in frantic protest. Heads turned. People shielded their eyes against the morning sun, confusion etched on their faces. And then they saw it. A UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter, matte black, enormous, sliced through the sky like a shadow falling across the town. Its rotors roared above Riverside Park, cutting through the silence. Leaves and dust exploded into the air. Screams erupted, not of fear, but of awe. Children clutched their parents, cars screeched to halts. Cell phones flew into trembling hands, capturing shaky footage of something that felt too surreal to be real. Hovering just above the park's wide, grassy clearing, the chopper descended with slow, deliberate control. Its landing gear pressed into the field with a heavy, cushioned thud. The blades kept turning, slower now, but persistent. Then the side hatch opened. 4 soldiers emerged, dressed head to toe in tactical black, their eyes hidden behind mirrored goggles. They moved like one organism, fluid, focused, no hesitation, no wasted movement. In seconds, they formed a perimeter around the aircraft, their boots kicking up swirls of dust that caught the morning light. Then came the 5th figure. He wore a formal military dress uniform, immaculate and sharp. His chest bore rows of medals that gleamed in the sun. He looked to be in his late 50s, tall and proud, with silver at his temples and eyes that carried the weight of decades. He didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the growing crowd that had fallen completely silent. Veterans, business owners, morning walkers, They all stood in collective breathlessness. Without breaking stride, the officer made his way across the field, directly to where Frank still sat beneath the trees, unmoved. Frank's gaze remained skyward, as though he'd seen this all before, perhaps in dreams or memories too painful to revisit. But there was no surprise in his expression, only stillness, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. The officer stopped before him. A pause hung in the air. Then slowly and with solemn respect, the man removed his cap, bowed his head slightly, and said, "Sir, we apologize for keeping you waiting." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, barely audible, "Did he just say sir?" Frank blinked slowly. His eyes met the officer's, and for several long seconds, neither man spoke. But something shifted in the atmosphere, like time folding in on itself. The quiet between them was heavier than the roar of rotor blades. It was filled with memory, with recognition, with a story no one else could fully understand. One of the soldiers stepped forward. In his hands, he held a neatly folded cloth, an official service jacket, fresh and pressed. He extended it with quiet deference. Frank didn't move at first. Then, as if summoned by something deeper than duty, he rose to his feet. He took the jacket with care, draped it over his arm. His back straightened, not rigidly, but with the kind of quiet strength only earned through a life of enduring. A veteran's strength, a commander's poise. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Side by side with the officer, Frank began walking toward the helicopter. The crowd remained frozen, unsure whether to cheer, cry, or simply remain still. Phones were lowered, eyes watched, some filled with tears they didn't fully understand. The helicopter's ramp swallowed them slowly. No fanfare, no ceremony, just reverent silence. The blades accelerated, the dust churned once more. And then, with a thunderous lift, the Blackhawk rose into the sky and vanished above the rooftops. The field grew still again. Dust settled on shoes, on benches, on leaves, but nothing felt the same. That bench under the trees, it was no longer just a bench. It was a monument now, one shaped not from stone, but from mystery and reverence. Frank Holloway, the quiet old man no one really saw, had never been forgotten, just misplaced. Until now. The questions began the moment the Blackhawk disappeared. By noon, news vans packed the street edges. Reporters with wide eyes and trembling microphones pointed their lenses at the field. Words like covert operation, long-lost war hero, and unannounced military extraction buzzed through the air. Social media caught fire. Blurry photos, shaky videos, threads full of wild theories and quiet tributes. But none of it could quite capture what those who were there felt in that moment, that they had witnessed something sacred, something real. And Riverside Park, once so ordinary, would never be the same again. The story was almost too extraordinary, too much like a scene from a movie to believe at first. But it wasn't until the Department of Defense called a press conference the next day that the full, astonishing truth came into focus. Two American flags stood tall on either side of the podium. A senior Pentagon spokesperson, flanked by uniformed military officials, stepped in front of the cameras. What was meant to be a brief statement quickly evolved into something far more significant, a historic revelation that rewrote a forgotten chapter of the Vietnam War. Yesterday, the spokesperson began, the United States military successfully reestablished contact with Captain Franklin T. Holloway, the former commander of Echo Unit 6, a covert reconnaissance team presumed lost during a classified mission in Southeast Asia in 1978. A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the room. The spokesperson continued, steady but visibly moved. For more than 45 years, Captain Holloway was listed as missing in action. He was believed to have perished after his team failed to return from a deep penetration mission inside Laos during a critical and unstable phase near the end of the Vietnam conflict. What followed stunned not only the journalists in the room, but veterans and families across the country. According to newly declassified portions of the operations report, Echo 6 had been ambushed in hostile territory. 5 members of Holloway's team were captured by enemy forces. Faced with limited options and no clear path to safety, Holloway made a decision that defied conventional command logic. He chose not to retreat. He didn't call for extraction. Instead, he disappeared, voluntarily. Slipping behind enemy lines, he began tracking his captured men, moving stealthily through unfamiliar terrain. For weeks, he survived alone in the jungle, gathering intelligence, avoiding detection, and hunting for any trace of his men. Eventually, against all odds, he located and freed 4 of the 5 prisoners. The 5th had already been executed. Then Holloway did something few could have imagined. Weakened and worn, he led the remaining survivors back through treacherous jungle terrain without any radio contact, living off the land and evading enemy patrols. By the time they reached U.S. forces, they were on the edge of collapse, emaciated, exhausted, barely alive. But Holloway didn't stay. He handed over the survivors to a secondary unit and vanished once more into the wilderness, refusing to return with the others. He chose anonymity and solitude over commendation or applause. A reporter at the press conference raised the question on everyone's mind. Why had he never come back? The spokesperson paused, the weight of the answer evident. Captain Holloway suffered from what we now understand as severe combat-related PTSD. At the time, there wasn't proper recognition or support for those suffering such trauma. Like many veterans of his generation, he was uncomfortable with recognition. Medals didn't mean much to him. Peace did. After returning to American soil under a false identity, Holloway lived in the shadows. He refused VA assistance, denied all offers of support, and avoided anything that might tie him back to his former life. He worked odd jobs across various states, Montana, Texas, New Mexico, never staying long in one place. He remained a ghost, living with quiet dignity and deep scars the public never saw. It wasn't until years later, when a photograph circulated online, an old man standing beside a Blackhawk helicopter during a veterans event in Riverside Park, that someone noticed the bracelet on his wrist. It wasn't just any bracelet. It was a cloth band, handcrafted and distributed only to members of Echo 6. That single detail unraveled everything. Military intelligence sprang into action. Fingerprint records were unearthed. DNA samples from an old Army personnel file were cross-checked. It all matched. And just like that, Franklin Holloway was no longer a phantom. He was Captain Holloway once again, a war hero and the leader of one of the most respected and mysterious units in U.S. military history. A man the nation had never even thanked. Until now. As the press conference neared its close, another reporter asked the question that lingered in the air. Would Captain Holloway receive the Medal of Honor? The spokesperson responded with quiet gravity. The department is currently reviewing the matter, but based on what we know, Captain Holloway never wanted medals. He wanted peace. That answer seemed to say it all. He hadn't returned to be celebrated or paraded before the cameras. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the weight of everything he had carried alone for decades. Or perhaps it was something deeper, the need to lay his ghosts to rest. Whatever the reason, he had come back. Not to be seen, but finally to be understood. Weeks went by. The buzz of the press died down, but the story didn't fade. In Riverside Park, beneath the old elm tree where Holloway had once quietly sat and watched the world pass him by, the city placed a simple stone bench. Polished, understated, yet full of reverence. A small bronze plaque adorned it. It read, Frank Holloway. Every morning just after sunrise, a quiet crowd began to form near the bench beneath the old oak tree. At first, it was just a few veterans, some still in uniform, others in worn jackets and weathered caps, who gathered in silence. They came not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Respect. Beneath the simple inscription on the bench, Holloway, the silent keeper of peace, there was a smaller line, almost easy to miss. For those who served without asking to be seen. Soon the gatherings grew. Teachers began bringing their students, lining them up in neat rows beside the flagpole. Children, some barely old enough to tie their shoes, would raise their hands in shaky salutes. Others just stood quietly, their faces curious but solemn. What began as a quiet, unofficial act of remembrance evolved into a daily ritual that wove itself into the rhythm of the town. At the heart of this movement was Liam Carson, the boy who had once been dismissed as curious, even bothersome, but now held a new title, the one who uncovered the truth. When the local school invited him to speak at the Veterans Day Assembly, he stood nervously under the gymnasium lights, the weight of his message pressing against his chest. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a wrinkled piece of paper. "My name is Liam," he began, his voice catching in his throat. "And I want to tell you about someone who didn't live in a big house or wear shiny medals. He lived on a bench." A hush swept across the room. Parents leaned forward in their seats. Veterans nodded, eyes fixed on the boy. "He didn't talk wakati. Liam Bidalki. People thought he had nothing, but really, he had given everything. From his pocket, Liam pulled out a photograph of the simple cloth bracelet, a faded symbol, fraying at the edges, yet heavy with meaning. "Some heroes don't wear armor," he said, his voice now steady. "Some don't even want to be called heroes. Some just carry a sleeping bag, and eyes that have seen too much, and ask for nothing in return." The gym fell into complete silence. No one shifted, no one whispered. For a moment, the world paused. "We walked past him for years," Liam said, quietly. "We never looked, but he never stopped watching over us. And now that we finally see him, let's never forget him." Frank Holloway, the man they'd once overlooked, had disappeared again. Some said he was back under the care of the military, the same system that had once let him slip through the cracks. But it didn't matter where he had gone. What mattered was what he left behind, not in medals or headlines, but in memory, in the presence of that bench, and in a story that would no longer be ignored. His legacy had taken root in the town's soul, not because of ceremonies or fanfare, but because of a quiet truth. Someone who had once been invisible had finally been seen. In a world that rushes to judge by appearances, this story whispers a different call. It asks us to slow down, to notice, to wonder who we might be passing by. The veteran standing behind us at the grocery store, the janitor sweeping hallways at dawn, the elderly man sitting alone at a diner, stirring at his coffee in silence. How many have given everything, only to fade into the background? To older generations, this story resonates deeply. You've lived the history, witnessed the wars, the sacrifice, the dignity that was earned without applause. Maybe you knew a man like Frank, or maybe you were one. And to the younger hearts listening, it holds a lesson just as vital: the power of respect, the importance of listening, and the courage it takes to see beyond what's visible. So we ask you, have you ever met a Frank Holloway? Someone whose quiet strength went unnoticed until you finally saw them? We'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. These moments matter. These voices deserve to be heard. And if Frank's story touched your heart, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and helping us continue to bring the forgotten into the light. Because stories like Frank's, stories of silent courage and unseen sacrifice, must never be forgotten. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.